At 63 years old, Mark Messier still stands with the same authority that defined him through 4 decades of hockey. His presence carries a weight that cannot be taught. It is earned through battles, through pressure, through triumphs that only a handful of players in the history of the sport can understand. 6 Stanley Cup championships, 2 Hart trophies, 1 Conn Smythe, and a career that turned him into one of the most complete players the league has ever seen. People still talk about the way he skated. Not graceful, but powerful. Every stride felt like a warning. Every time he entered a corner, it was a test of courage for anyone who dared challenge him. That is why the name, the Moose, stayed with him. It was not a nickname built for fun. It was a description of force, a symbol of how he controlled space on the ice. He owned the boards. He owned the pace. He owned whatever part of the rink he stepped into. Yet the legend of Mark Messier is not only about trophies and leadership. Beneath the calm voice and the steady glare lived a competitor who remembered every slight, every reckless hit. Every moment when an opponent tried to push past the line. Fans saw a dependable captain. Opponents saw something else. They saw the fire, the edge, the instinct that turned certain nights into personal wars. Those memories stayed with him. Those battles shaped him. Before we break down the list, we need to understand who he is and why opponents feared him. These are the 5 men Mark Messier could never forgive on the ice, the ones who pushed the Moose to the edge of his pride. Mark Messier was born in Edmonton and raised in a hockey culture that shaped every part of his identity. For him, the game was never just about skating or scoring. It was a test of will, a measure of how much a player was willing to push through. That mindset appeared early. As a teenager, he stepped into professional hockey with a confidence that surprised many older players. He was young, but he carried himself like someone who already understood the grind of this sport. When the Edmonton Oilers reached the NHL and began building one of the greatest dynasties ever seen, Messier grew into the role that defined him. He did not play the game gently. He attacked shifts with power. He protected teammates. And he made opponents feel every inch of contact along the boards. Standing beside Wayne Gretzky, he formed a partnership that blended intelligence and force. Gretzky changed how hockey was played. Messier changed how it felt. The 5 Stanley Cup championships he collected in Edmonton marked him as a pillar of that dynasty. Then came the move to New York. A different city, a different expectation. The Rangers had not lifted the Stanley Cup in more than 50 years, and the entire organization looked to Messier to change that story. He embraced the pressure with the same intensity he brought into every corner battle. He became the first captain in NHL history to lead 2 different teams to a championship. New York saw him as a savior. Edmonton continued to see him as the heartbeat of a warrior. To understand the grudges he carries, you need to understand how he approached every game. With Messier, respect and anger lived side by side, and a few opponents pushed him to the edge. Number 5 is Scott Stevens. Anyone who watched hockey in the 90s remembers how he controlled a game. He was powerful, he was sudden, and he made every forward think carefully before crossing the blue line. For Mark Messier, he was one of the rare opponents who forced him to brace for contact every single shift. Stevens played the position with a purpose that made him stand out. He watched the puck closely, he timed his steps, and when he decided to close space, he did it with full commitment. Messier never feared contact, but Stevens delivered it with a level of force that turned routine plays into moments of danger. That tension became the foundation of their rivalry. One of the first hits that stayed with Messier happened at Madison Square Garden. The Rangers were pushing the pace. Messier picked up the puck near center ice and drove forward as he had done countless times. Stevens read the play in an instant and met him with a clean but heavy hit. The sound carried through the entire building. Messier got up immediately, but inside he felt the spark of anger that comes from being challenged in such a direct way. The clashes grew sharper during the 1994 Eastern Conference Final. Every game felt like a struggle for control. The Devils used structure and discipline. The Rangers relied on Messier's leadership. In that environment, Stevens became the barrier Messier had to break through. Every time Messier tried to create space, Stevens stepped into the lane. Every attempt to push the puck deep became a battle of strength and will. Messier respected toughness. He valued it, But there is a difference between respect and comfort. Stevens made his nights harder. He forced him to absorb contact that drained energy and momentum. He pushed him to the edge of frustration, and Messier never forgot opponents who brought him to that point. Stevens was not a talker. Messier was not either. Their rivalry lived in silence. It lived in the boards. It lived in the moments when both men rose from a collision and refused to show pain. Those moments form the kind of memory that stays with a player long after retirement. That is why Scott Stevens sits at number 5. He was the defender who made Messier grind for every inch of ice. He did not fear him, he confronted him. And for a competitor like Messier, that kind of opponent is impossible to forget. Number 4 is Claude Lemieux. If Scott Stevens brought power, Lemieux brought something else. He brought irritation. He brought chaos. He played with an edge that made opponents lose focus, and he enjoyed every second of it. For Mark Messier, that style cut deep because it attacked not only the body, but also the mind. Lemieux built his reputation on playoff intensity. He had a talent for scoring in big moments, but he also had a talent for drawing opponents into emotional battles. He chirped, he poked, he delivered contact at the exact moment it would sting the most. Messier respected competitiveness, but he did not tolerate players who tried to twist the game into a psychological trap. Lemieux did that better than almost anyone of his era. Their tension became clear during meetings between the Rangers and Devils in the early 90s. These games were physical and heavy from the opening faceoff. Messier carried the responsibility of leadership. Lemieux carried the responsibility of throwing the opponent off balance. When those responsibilities met, the atmosphere turned sharp. Lemieux knew exactly which players to target. Messier was at the top of his list because stopping him meant stopping the heart of New York. One moment that stayed with Messier happened during a tight game late in the season. Messier had possession near the boards and prepared to send the puck across the zone. Lemieux came from behind with a bump that was small enough to stay within the rules but heavy enough to deliver a message. Messier turned with an expression that revealed everything. He felt the disrespect. Lemieux skated away without reaction. That silence irritated Messier even more than the hit itself. The animosity peaked in the playoffs when every shift carried weight. Lemieux scored timely goals. He threw well-timed hits. He forced Rangers players into retaliating, and Messier hated seeing his team dragged into emotional mistakes. It went against everything he preached in the locker room. Control, discipline, determination. Lemieux attacked all three. Messier never dismissed the skill. He understood the winning mentality that made Lemieux successful, but he also remembered the nights when Lemieux's antics pushed him to the edge. It was not fear, it was frustration. And frustration can grow into something heavier. That is why Claude Lemieux sits at number 4. He was not the biggest opponent Messier faced, not the strongest, but he was the one who made every shift feel like a test of patience and pride. For Messier, that was enough to leave a mark he never forgot. Number 3 is Cam Neely. When people talk about pure power in hockey, his name appears immediately. He was fast, he was heavy, and he attacked the net with a force that made defenders panic. For Mark Messier, facing Neely meant facing a forward who matched his intensity stride for stride. That alone created a rivalry filled with tension. Neely played the game with a straightforward philosophy. Drive the puck deep, protect it with strength, finish every chance with authority. There was no deception, no hesitation. Everything was direct. And direct players always brought out the hardest version of Messier. Whenever Rangers met the Bruins, the spotlight naturally drifted toward their collisions. Fans expected them, players braced for them. One moment that stayed with Messier happened during a hard-fought game in Boston. Neely broke down the wing at full speed, and Messier read the rush perfectly. Instead of pulling back, he stepped up to meet him. The contact between them was heavy enough to shake both benches. Neely bounced off and kept skating. Messier held his ground. Neither man showed pain, but both of them carried that hit into every shift that followed. The intensity grew during later matchups when Boston relied on Neely to set the tone. He scored goals in tight spaces. He punished defenders with legal but punishing body checks. Messier respected the skill, but he also felt the growing pressure. Any mistake meant Neely would turn it into a scoring chance. Any soft play along the boards meant Neely would overpower the lane. Messier hated being pushed into defensive posture because it went against his instinct to control the game. What made Neely a lasting rival was the lack of gamesmanship. He did not chirp, he did not provoke, he simply attacked with raw force. That honesty made the battles cleaner, but also more difficult. Messier knew exactly what was coming and still found it hard to stop. It was frustration without words, pressure without noise, and these are the kinds of moments that carve their way into a player's memory. Cam Neely sits at number 3 because he represented the type of opponent who could push Messier physically and mentally. He brought weight. He brought speed. He brought a test of strength that demanded everything from him. And any player who forces Mark Messier to grind at that level earns a permanent place in his list of rivals he never forgot. Number 2 is Brendan Shanahan. If there was a player built to challenge Mark Messier in every corner of the rink, it was him. Shanahan had size, he had scoring touch, and he had a willingness to step into physical battles without hesitation. For Messier, this combination made Shanahan one of the most difficult matchups of his career. Their rivalry began when Shanahan was still young and rising fast. Even then, he carried himself with a confidence that felt familiar to Messier. He skated hard, he shot hard, he hit hard, and he never seemed bothered by the reputation of the men he faced. Messier noticed that. He respected it, but he also bristled at the idea that a younger power forward was trying to make his name through direct confrontation. Games between Rangers and teams featuring Shanahan always carried a subtle charge. Anytime they lined up near each other, fans leaned forward. Their first real clash came during a tight game in Hartford. Messier battled for the puck along the boards when Shanahan arrived with a strong shoulder that sent the play flying. It was clean but heavy. Messier reacted with the look of someone who had been challenged directly. Shanahan did not say a word. He simply skated away. And that silence made the moment sharper. As Shanahan moved to St. Louis, then Detroit, the rivalry traveled with him. He became one of the league's premier power forwards, and his confidence grew with every season. When he met Messier in later years, their battles became a study of stubbornness. Shanahan pushed the pace. Messier pushed back. Sometimes they collided. Sometimes they tangled in front of the net. Sometimes they exchanged long stares after a whistle. They never needed theatrics. Their competitiveness did the talking. What irritated Messier most was Shanahan's refusal to yield. Many players respected Messier's space out of caution. Shanahan treated that space like any other. He forced Messier to fight for possession in situations he usually controlled. He matched strength with strength and at times even tilted the advantage. That feeling stayed with Messier because he rarely met opponents who could disrupt his rhythm so consistently. Shanahan sits at number 2 because he was the kind of rival who combined skill and force in equal measure. He did not provoke, he did not play dirty. He simply met Messier head-on and refused to step aside. For a competitor who valued dominance as much as Messier, that made the rivalry unforgettable. Number 1 is Eric Lindros. In the mid-90s, no opponent challenged Mark Messier with more raw force than him. Lindros entered the league as a phenomenon. Big body, heavy stride, dominant presence. He played with the confidence of someone who believed he could take over any game, and for Messier, that belief felt like a direct threat. Lindros represented the next generation of power forwards. He did not avoid contact, he created it. He controlled the middle of the ice with a blend of strength and skill that was rare even in a physical era. When Rangers and Flyers met, the tension rose immediately because everyone understood what it meant for Messier. It meant he had to face a younger version of the style he had championed for years. Their first real confrontation came in a heated game in Philadelphia. Messier carried the puck through the neutral zone and Lindros stepped toward him with a challenge that felt almost symbolic. The collision was loud. Both men bounced off each other. Both stayed upright. The crowd exploded, and Messier felt something he did not often feel. He felt someone trying to take his ground. As the rivalry grew, the battles intensified. Lindros drove the puck hard along the boards. Messier met him with equal strength. Sometimes they pushed. Sometimes they locked arms. Sometimes they separated only because referees intervened. These moments were not about showmanship. They were about control. Lindros wanted to impose his presence. Messier refused to surrender the authority he had built over 2 decades. What irritated Messier most was Lindros's physical confidence. Few players in the league could knock him off balance. Lindros could. Few players could out-muscle him in tight spaces. Lindros sometimes managed it. And every time it happened, Messier felt the spark of anger that comes from being tested by someone who felt destined to take your place. There was also the emotional weight of leadership. Messier viewed himself as the standard for toughness. Lindros represented a new standard rising quickly. Their battles were not just about the puck. They were about identity. They were about the question of who owned the center of the rink. Eric Lindros sits at number 1 because he was the only opponent who made Messier feel the full pressure of time. He challenged his body. He challenged his pride. And he challenged the legacy of the Moose in a way no one else ever did. When Mark Messier looks back on his career, he remembers more than the trophies. He remembers the nights that demanded everything from him, the long battles in the corners, the hits that shook the boards, the opponents who refused to step aside. That is what shaped him. That is what he carried through 6 Stanley Cup championships and through every shift where leadership was not about words but about will. Scott Stevens tested his body. Claude Lemieux tested his patience. Cam Neely tested his strength. Brendan Shanahan tested his pride. And Eric Lindros tested his place in the game itself. Each man brought something different. Power, pressure, provocation, confidence. These qualities pushed Messier into the battles that defined his legacy. They forced him to dig deeper. They reminded him that greatness begins in the moments when you cannot step back. For Messier, these rivals were not just names on a list. They were the obstacles he had to overcome to become the Moose. They made him angry. They made him sharper. They made him understand how far he could push himself when the game demanded it. In hockey, the toughest opponents are often the ones who leave the deepest impression. For Messier, these 5 shaped the story of his competitive fire. And now, as he speaks openly about those years, the honesty feels natural. He is old enough to remember every clash clearly, calm enough to reflect without hesitation, but still fierce enough to admit which players he never forgot. These are the 5 men who challenged Mark Messier at the highest level of the sport. The 5 who left marks on his career and on his memory. So the question remains for you. If you watch the game through those years, who do you believe pushed the Moose the hardest? Who was the one opponent he truly hated facing?